the 23rd NERPS webinar series on peace and sustainability in the context of global change. And this is jointly organized by the IDEC Institute. My name is Dalia Simangan, one of the core members of NERPS, and I will be your moderator for today. So just a bit of a background, this webinar series started in 2020, and it is a platform for thinking and rethinking, updating our understanding of peace and sustainability amidst global transformations. I'm sure my NERPS colleagues agree with me that we're very happy that we are continuing these important discussions online and in person. So thank you to our in-person participants and our online participants joining us today. Just a bit of housekeeping rules for our online attendees. If you have questions, anytime you can type them in the Q&A box, or you can also raise your hand and then I will enable your microphone so you can ask the questions directly to our speaker. Water in itself is a highly contentious natural resource, and availability and access to it further complicate the many issues surrounding it. So I encourage you all online and in person to ask questions, but also to share your insights and your reflections after the talk. Our speaker today is actually our newly cross-appointed faculty member at NERPS Hiroshima University, and she just arrived a couple of days ago. Dr. Catherine Alfredo is an assistant professor at the University of South Florida at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Dr. Catherine's research focuses on sustainable potable water provisions within the US and also internationally, specifically in Ghana and in India. Prior to her current positions, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University's Earth Institute, a recipient of Fulbright Nehru Postdoctoral Fellowship, a scholarship, and then later the research program manager at BC Water. She earned advanced degrees in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Texas in Austin and holds a professional engineering license in the state of Virginia. So Catherine is one of our cross-appointed faculty members. We have 4 faculty members for this starting this year. And Catherine's research cluster is titled How Poor Households Negotiate Access to Clean Water to Improve Technology Implementation and Safe Water Communication in the Indian Communities of Eastern Maharashtra and West Bengal. So the purpose of our cross-appointed faculty members is to create and develop research clusters at Hiroshima University. And these research clusters are transdisciplinary research clusters that encourage researchers and students to be part of this broader research projects that we aim to be more long-term. That means even after their cross-appointment. All right. Okay, I think I'll end there. So thank you for your time again today, and I look forward to the dynamic discussions later. And Catherine, thank you for your time today, and you may now start your presentation.
Thank you. Is the mic working? Yeah, okay. So thank you for the introduction, Dalia, and I'm going to jump right in. So many of us here are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. I know a lot of you work in different areas or one of the different 17. I primarily focus on Sustainable Development Goal number 6, so clean water and sanitation. And it's to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And just to give you some statistics based on 2022 statistics from the UN, at the current rates by 2030, there'll be 1.6 billion people that will lack safely managed drinking water, 2.8 billion people will lack safely managed sanitation, and 1.9 billion people will lack basic hand hygiene facilities. And I focus on this one here, drinking water. Now, there's 1.6 billion people that will lack safely managed, and even more lack the limited or the basic drinking water provisions. The two targets underneath this that really pertain to the work that I'm going to talk about today are target 6.1, which is by 2030, achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. And target 6B, which is support and strengthen the participation of local communities in improving water and sanitation management. So today I'm going to talk about really two different case studies and how this has been implemented and some ways that I think we can improve on how we actually track these metrics. Now, before the Sustainable Development Goals, when there was the Millennium Development Goals, if there was a community that didn't have any access to drinking water, they would just go in and build some infrastructure, right? And while things have changed slightly with the Sustainable Development Goals, infrastructure still really equals access according to these metrics. And one of the issues, which I'm hoping to highlight today, is that as soon as a community gets some sort of infrastructure, they're basically a check mark on a list, right? So a well is drilled, a bore well, a pump is put on it, and this community now has drinking water. But that is one snapshot of one moment in time. It does not speak to sustainability, and it does not speak to whether this community actually has it into the future. So now again, before the Sustainable Development Goals, with Millennium Development Goals, we just had improved water sources and unimproved water sources. So as long as you went from drinking surface water or a source that was open to some sort of contamination, like a hand-dug well, into the improved water source realm, then you were considered having access. With the Sustainable Development Goals, this got a little bit more nuanced. While this is still all improved drinking water sources, there are different levels now of improved drinking water or access according to the Sustainable Development Goals. You can have limited access, which means that you have a collection time over 30 minutes. So walking to a community source, collection, and walking back is more than 30 minutes. If it's less than 30 minutes, that travel time, wait time, collection time, you would have basic access. And then safely managed, if you notice, this is the first one where we actually have any kind of mention of quality of the drinking water. So under safely managed, not only is it on premises, available when needed, but it's free of fecal and priority contamination. So again, this is the only place where we actually have any kind of indication of water quality in these metrics. So using this scale, 1 in 4 people lack safely managed drinking water services in 2020. And this is more prevalent in the rural areas globally than in urban areas. Urban areas have more safely managed and basic coverage in terms of drinking water services. So what I want to do is highlight 2 different case studies of work that I've done in the past and the work that I hope to continue as part of my cross appointment here with NERPS. The first one is in Eastern Maharashtra, India, where there is groundwater contamination, naturally occurring fluoride. And the other one is in West Bengal, India, where again, there's a geogenic or naturally occurring contamination that is arsenic. So first, let's focus on Eastern Maharashtra in India. Before I launch into the discussion of this, I want to highlight some of the funders and my collaborators on this project. We do have 2 papers that are out associated with this research, the previous research. It was funded by Fulbright and the Earth Institute with Columbia University, both of which were where I did my postdocs. My co-author on this is Dr. Tanya O'Gara, who is now a researcher at the National University of Singapore. And then my 2 project partners in India are Dr. Pawan Labasatwar and Dr. Kapil Chandrayan. And Kapil and I will be working on the next phase of this together and continue to collaborate. So here's the situation. So these areas in Eastern Maharashtra where there's a lot of fluoride present, the government really has 3 choices. First, they go in and they say, okay, are there any wells that are available that don't have fluoride? Fluoride is usually a very, covers a lot of area. It's the whole aquifer. So usually no. Okay, so that's not an option. The second thing they say is, okay, can we pipe in water to a standpipe or a time tap in the center of the community and have a water source that way? And if that's not possible, because again, of the geographic area where there's fluoride. The third kind of solution that they do is they implement one of these drinking water treatment plants. And so I focus on electrocoagulation, which is just one way of treating the drinking water. These were put in under 5-year contracts. So the government hired a company under a 5-year contract to site, build, work with the communities, and then operate it for those 5 years, and then turn it over to the community. And why this is important is because of this target 6B. It's really common development practice that the theory is that if the community owns it, they will value it more. They'll want to take care of it more. And so part of this the practice of handing over technology to the community is because it wants to strengthen the participation and increase sustainability. Now, when we started this project, as you could see before, with the Sustainable Development Goals, none of those goals actually talk about what it means to have successful drinking water treatment or successful technology. So then we had to start thinking about, well, how do we then define success? If we're going to evaluate these treatment plants out into the future, what does it mean to be successful? So we thought about, well, if you have a certain number of treatment plants installed, over time, they might break or not be used anymore. And those that continue into the future, that's where we have sustainability, the continued success. And we're really measuring the success in 2 different ways. Functionality, does it turn on? And efficiency, does it actually treat what it's supposed to treat? And what we believe is that only when functionality and efficiency are sustained over time, again, not just snapshot, not just one point in time, but over time, then water treatment may be considered sustainable and a success. If you remember what I discussed in the beginning is that a lot of these things, it's only one point in time, right? So the research aim here was then to identify the determinants of successful management of a community-based water treatment systems. So what factors influence success and how do they interact? We did several different things in order to address this. This was a project that went on for about 2 years. We did a contingent valuation survey. So this is a willingness to pay study. How much are you willing to pay per month, per container, in different types of payment plans in order to support the continuation of the drinking water treatment plant? Lab and field experiments, these were cooperation games or public good games. They're commonly used in economics. And what we do is we put people in a room, we give them some rupees, and we say, if you pay into the common good, that pool of money is then split and paid back out. So if everyone pays in, everyone doubles their money. Or I guess the money that's in the pot is doubled and then paid back out. If everyone pays in but one person, that one person makes a lot more money than everyone else. So it's really about cooperation and everyone working together. And it's a way to simulate cooperation around a common good, like an aquifer or a water treatment plant. So it looks for people who are free riding, who don't want to pay but want to use the resource. I did a technical analysis of the treatment plants. We did in-depth operator interviews over time in order to get our timeline of functionality, and then in-depth case studies. And what I'm going to attempt to do is kind of slam all of this together and give you the highlights of all of this research. So we worked in 11 villages that were at that point of handover. So the 5-year contract was over, and the community is about to receive the treatment plant, or just received it within the last month of owning and operating the treatment plant themselves. Now, on paper, all of these communities have basic services, right? They have a safe drinking water source that's within 30 minutes round trip that's available for them, and it's clean. Who cares if it's potable, I guess, but it was potable. So the first thing we tracked over 2 years is, was it functional for the entire 2 years? And after 2 years of handover, only one of them was still functioning. Again, can turn it on. Whether or not it's efficient is another story. So only one of them was actually still functioning after 2 years. So again, on paper, everyone has water though, right? Now, the reason for non-functionality, and this is also important because of that target 6B, is lack of Grand Panchayat support. So when the water system is turned over to the community, the local governing agent, the local governing body, the Grand Panchayat, are the ones who were tasked with operating or managing it. So a lot of the issues came from a lack of Grand Panchayat support. That means they didn't want to pay an operator. They didn't want to pay, in some cases, the electric bills weren't paid. Electrocoagulation does take electricity. So if the electric bills weren't paid, then it just got cut off to the machine. There were several that had technical problems. And again, this is an issue with the handover process. It was handed over. And when we talked to operators and we said, well, if something breaks, what do you do? And they say, oh, well, we call the company. But these people who had things break, when they called the company was like, oh no, you own it now. You need to figure it out. So there was no service plan or anything put into place to help the community actually fix things. So 30% failed because of technical issues, but 70% was because of a lack of support from the Grand Panchayat. Yeah. So in this case, the household, so there were, in some places, there was a water tax that was issued by the community. We were actually asking them, one of our surveys, we did ask, would you be willing to pay, and got a willingness to pay. As it stood right now, not every community had to pay for water. It was free in a lot of communities still. Yeah. And then if we look at how long they were functional after handover, within a year, a half of them were no longer functional. So these treatment plants that cost a lot of money, that are big infrastructure, that are solving a water quality issue for the community, once it was handed over to the community, failed within a year. So obviously there's an issue, big issue here with sustainability. And then one of the other things we explored was it functional the entire period? And this is important because if something breaks and you're able to recover from that, that does show that there is some resilience within the system. So 3 of them did have a technical problem and were able to recover from it and continue working before they ultimately stopped working. So one of the things we explored with all the data that we collected was, well, we have this one community that was still functioning, it can still turn on. Was it different than the other communities? Did people value it more? Were they willing to pay more for it? Was this a resource that they just felt was more important? So I have all 11 villages on the bottom on the x-axis here, and the ones with the asterisk or the star are those that failed because of Grand Panchayat support. And what I'm going to show is the monthly contributions that people said they were willing to contribute towards the management of the treatment plant. So most other communities with statistical significance, those with the M's above it, those were willing to actually contribute more towards the drinking water treatment plant than the one that was still functioning. But there was no correlation between those that wanted to pay more to support it and how they failed, whether it's because of Grand Panchayat support or technical issues. It was kind of all over the place. Yeah. No, it was while they were still functioning. Yes, that was a good question. The question was, for those of you online who couldn't hear it, was this willingness to pay study conducted before they were out not functioning anymore? So for one, yes, because that one was not functioning and then never came back into functioning. But for all the others, we did it right at handover. We were on the ground when handover took place, basically, or right before. So we tried to do the willingness to pay before the handover was complete. So to dive into this deeper, we selected 4 communities, the one that was still functioning and 2 that recovered from a technical setback, and then 1 that did not, and did some case studies, did some, semi-structured interviews with the Grand Panchayat. So we classified these as high success, the one that was still operating, medium success, they operated for more than 1.5 years and recovered from a problem, and then low success, one that operated for less than 12 months and never recovered. So from all the interviews, what we could take out of it was that in the community that was still functioning, the Gram Panchayat actually voted as to whether or not continue supporting the treatment plan. So they held a village-wide vote as to whether or not people wanted this to be something that they were going to support. This did not occur in the other villages that we talked to. So this was something that we felt was really important. The other thing that came out that was different between the one that was still functioning and those that weren't was the involvement of the women in the Gram Panchayat. There's a quota system where there has to be a certain number of seats on the Gram Panchayat that are filled by women. And a lot of times the women hold the seat in name only, but the husbands go. And so in the one village that was still working, Malvira, it was the one where when we asked to speak to the women, they were actually there and they were very active, and they do not allow any surrogacy from the husband. So we felt that that was another important aspect into how this community was running it. The thing that was really interesting is that these really correlated well with our public good games, which I'm not going to show the results from, but the biggest motivator for people to cooperate and to pay more towards the community pot in our public good games was negotiation, when they were able to talk to each other and actually talk about how much everyone wanted to contribute. And that increased cooperation. And what we saw here is that the Gram Panchayat having the vote, letting people have a voice, really came into having more cooperation and more willingness to support the treatment plans. So we feel like this is something that should be explored more and should be looked at, especially when we think about access and who has access, who's actually being part of this negotiation. Are there any community members that are left out? And where are these treatment plants being cited, which is another big issue. So, yes. Oh, yes.
So, about the Gram Panchayat, just I have a little bit small question. Like, you have approached to individual member of the house and family, so they were asking money for this water treatment. Have you ever approached any kind of charitable organization or something for that?
Yes. So the purpose of the study was to look at the community's willingness to support it and not for outside donors. Because outside donors could always come, but since the development theory is to hand it over to the community with or without any outside organization supporting it, it was really to look at when that handover happens, are people really willing to support it? Because you need some sort of tax in order to support, or some money to support the continued operation of a treatment plant. So it's really the communities want to support it, because that's what it's ultimately going to come down to. Not every community can have an outside donor. Yeah, good question though. So where we go from here, and what I hope to do as part of my cross-appointment research, which I would love to collaborate with anyone on, is the first thing is we need a database. You know, I have information on 11 treatment plants. There's over 80 that are in Eastern Maharashtra, and nobody knows anything about them. Nobody knows where they are. I mean, well, let's say this, the district level engineers have the paperwork on it. But according to like a central database, there's everything being brought together, knowing whether or not they're functioning. Again, on paper, all of these are check marks. All of these are communities that have water. So creating a database, pulling all this information together for Eastern Maharashtra, and then doing some semi-structured interviews with the operators again to get that timeline of what's going on, and then to start to do some correlations with some external drivers. So for example, is there a time of year where treatment plants are more likely to fail? So for example, this area of Maharashtra has a high suicide rate, farmer suicide rate. So during pre-monsoon area times, if the rains are delayed, if we look at climatic issues, do we see more treatment plants failing because people are stressed, right? If we can identify some of these external factors that are also potentially leading to the failures, we could then have some interventions that would support the community in times of need, so that the whole treatment plant doesn't go unsupported and then become irrelevant. The other thing is to really rethink how sustainability is thought of. We always think of the triple bottom line, but that doesn't really work very well for things like drinking water treatment plants in rural communities. So the framework that I'm thinking of is more of a social, environmental, technical interactions where looking at not only these separate spheres, but the interactions between each of them and how that impacts the sustainability of a treatment plant. And within this then, especially in the social components, it would really be looking at also how does caste or how does ethnic minority status impact who has access to the treatments and where they are cited and whether or not they succeed. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and tell you a little bit about the work in West Bengal, India. Now, again, this is an area that has arsenic as the water contamination, geogenic contaminant. Again, I want to highlight the funding for this has mainly been through Fulbright. Both Gokul and I had a postdoc Fulbright, he had a student Fulbright. The manuscript is coming soon. And he's currently a PhD student at MIT and will be working with me on the future work on this project that will be supported through the NERPS fellowship, the NERPS cross appointment. So arsenic is a major public health hazard in West Bengal, and 80% of households are reliant on untreated well water, so they have groundwater sources. 6 districts are classified as highly affected, and this includes Nadia district, where the research I'm going to show you took place. And it's estimated that over 6 billion people are exposed in West Bengal alone to high levels of arsenic or significant levels of arsenic. What makes this really interesting is that the safe sources are often distant, where almost every household has a borehole or a well on premises. So this would almost be in that safely managed category. There's water available on premises 24/7, right? They have a groundwater source right on their premise. Now, whether arsenic is considered a priority contaminant, I would say it is. So that would then bring it down to limited. But again, if we look at some of these metrics, everyone in this study would be considered as having access to drinking water. They are a checkbox. They are not a priority concern. Now, in the past, there's been soft infrastructure, so not just drilling a well, but then arsenic's also interesting in the sense that it depends on the well depth. So you can have unsafe sources on your home, but when they do a safe source, it's usually a different well depth. So the soft infrastructure is then convincing people through behavior changes to actually access that safe source. Information has been shown to drive source use, but can we optimize this? And what information is being disseminated, which I'll get into in a second. And there's many factors that can affect safe source adoption. And this friction of distance, or how far something is and how willing you're able to walk to it, is one thing that we explored in this research. We had 2 main research questions. Does information modify the association between distance and the probability of arsenic safe source adoption? And then how does consumed water differ from drinking water in terms of safe source use and adoption? And I'm going to talk mainly about this second one, because this is something that all the development metrics are pretty much missing. Yeah.
Arsenic from tube well water, because there you mentioned that is a dig tube well may do not have arsenic. So it's a very important because it is very close to Bangladesh, I think. Yes. So in our country, yeah, 11 or 1200 feet tube well water doesn't contain arsenic. So it's a big issue, right? Okay.
Yeah, so it's the depth, and it depends on where you are, whether it's shallow or deep. Sometimes the shallow ones are safe and the deep ones aren't safe. So it really depends on where you are. There are treatment mechanisms. There is adsorption and ion exchange, but then you run into the same issues that we had in the other study, where you need willingness to support it, you need to operate it, and you need to be able to upkeep the technology. And so in this case, all of the communities that we worked in here had a safe source, had a local time tap, or a safe source that was drilled by an NGO in the community. So again, they would still be in that having access realm. So yeah, there are ways to treat it. Here, they weren't using it. They had just an alternate source. Yeah. But I will say that in terms of treatment, arsenic, it's not just a West Bengal or Bangladesh issue. There's arsenic everywhere. And even in the US, there's huge arsenic issues. And it's one of the major health concerns we have with drinking water in communities that are arsenic exposed. Because for us, in the US, the drinking water standard is 10 micrograms per liter. And a lot of communities are in violation. It's one of it's the highest violation contaminant in the United States. So work on those issues as well. And even treatment there, it's expensive for smaller communities. It's expensive or harder to maintain, or it's just something that they just can't afford at the time without outside resources to install the treatment, the initial treatment methods. So for this one, we had different methods that we looked at. We did testing of everyone who participated in our study. We tested their wells. We tested the safe wells. We did water diaries with them, which is very different. And this is one of the things that makes our research a little unique compared to what's been done in the past. A lot of times people rely on just asking someone, what's your primary drinking water source? And how much did you get from that source, right? But what we did is we handed out buckets and we had people use that bucket for a week. I believe it was 10 days, 3 days were training, and then a week's worth of good data. And we had them record when they got a bucket, how much of it was used for drinking, cooking, washing, and all that kind of stuff. So we had very detailed information daily from all of our participants as to where they got their water source and what they used it for. Household level. Yes, this is all going to be a household level data.
Okay. Then what do you think about the network in the community?
Yeah, so I'll get to the network in a second. Yeah. We also walked to the source with them so that we had actual real ground truth data as to the distance and not just lines that meant nothing. And then we did a survey. And we used all this data to do an arsenic exposure model and then a two-part decision model. And I'm going to focus mainly on the arsenic exposure model for this, where we did consumption and comparison to projected water use. The other part is we really looked at how people decided to use which source, which is going to be the main focus of the first paper. But today I'm going to talk about the arsenic exposure model because most people were really good at accessing the safe source for drinking water. So on average, they were found to use different water sources for cooking and drinking. And one of the reasons why we structured the study this way is that both Gokul and I had experience living in India, and we both knew that people didn't use the same source for drinking, cooking, and chai. People would be like, oh, I use that for drinking. I use that for cooking. Oh, I like this one for my chai. And so people were making these decisions as to what water they used for different consumption. It wasn't just this is cooking and drinking and this is washing. It was even in the consumed water, people were deciding to make different choices. And safe source compliance for drinking water was almost 100%. 94% of our households used the safe source for drinking. They were like, of course I use that one. That's safe. That's my drinking source. But when it came to cooking water, it went down to 80%. So this goes back to, again, messaging. The messaging around everything is drinking water, is, even the metrics for the Sustainable Development Goal. It's how many people have drinking water, how many people have access to potable water, drinking water, drinking water. No one's talking about cooking water. So everyone knew I should use that for drinking water. But when it came time to cooking water, they're like, oh, I use this one. It's close, right? So we feel like there is this just-in-time nature to cooking that may determine where people are going to get their water from. And this can easily be something that can be remedied moving forward, right? We can talk about the dangers of drinking and cooking and talk about the dangers of consumed arsenic and not just drinking water arsenic. So does this matter? And that was our question then. Okay, so we know people are using different sources, but is it enough to actually matter in terms of arsenic risk exposure? So we did a really simplified risk calculation. The limit for cancer causing contaminants is 10 to the negative 4 for the US EPA. So anything above 10 to the negative 4 risk, they would consider it risky. Anything underneath that's like acceptable amount of risk. And what we did is we said that the probability of an individual developing cancer is the exposure rate. We use a chronic daily intake and a cancer slope factor. And the cancer slope factor is something that's fixed for arsenic. Within this chronic daily intake, this is where we could actually explore, well, does this matter? Exposure factor, exposure duration, body weight, and averaging time are all fixed parameters. So those are all things that are going to be fixed in the model, no matter what we're doing. But it's really the concentration and the ingestion rate that matter. And the default ingestion rate used for adults and children, again, is just based on drinking. So 2 liters a day for an adult and 1 liter a day for a child. So again, here's a snippet from the water and sanitation. Everything on this page is all about drinking water. There's not one mention of cooking water or consumed water anywhere within the Sustainable Development Goals. So this first model is really just based on how people are actually going to calculate this risk, because they don't have the data that we do. They might know how much arsenic is in the area and then approximate how much people are going to intake based on these default values. So that's what our model 1 is just drinking water, only using default ingestion rates, but actual arsenic concentration. Model 2, we use that default default drinking, but then we also use the default drinking cooking rate. So an ingestion rate for cooking, if we take the World Health Organization, it says that you need about 4.5 liters per day per person, regardless if you're a child or an adult, in order to survive. So we added that into our calculation, saying that, okay, if we are model 2, we have drinking and cooking, and we use the percent of different sources and multiply that out to get our how much is ingested. And then model 3 is the one where we use our actual data. So our high resolution data where we know where everyone is going for what purposes for their household. So what I'm going to show you here is we have the risk for an adult and the risk for a child. Sorry, this keeps coming down. I can't get rid of it. Along the x-axis, we have the 3 different methods, which I'll remind you of them when I pull it up. And this 4 here is 10 to the negative 4. So this is the acceptable risk according to the United States EPA. So if we look at drinking water only, we can say, okay, adults are fine, but children are at risk, which is something that we already know. So, and this is where people said they were going. This is not just assuming that they're drinking the safe source. So this is saying, which source do you use? Oh, I use that one. Okay, so this is how we have it. So even if the people who are making these decisions could still be having, their children could still be at risk for arsenic exposure. Now, when we add in cooking water, it goes down because there's so much water. And we're just assuming that they're using the same source that they're using for drinking, which we knew was a safer source for most of them for our default cooking. So drinking and cooking lowers it. But again, most of the time they're doing these calculations for adults, honestly. And so everything looks fine. When we go to the actual data though, what people are actually using for drinking, for cooking, how much they're collecting and how much they're using, with the big assumption being that all the water that's collected for cooking, we're assuming it's ingested. People are cooking rice, they're cooking curries. There's not much for cooking that you cook it and you pour it off. It's not like pasta where you like pour off the water and just keep the noodles, right? So you can see that when we actually account for it, almost everyone in the community is at risk. And we do see people with arsenicosis. So they have the hand rashes, they have the foot rashes that are the signs of arsenicosis in these villages. And they're like, but why? And this could be a reason why. We're not talking about drinking water. We're not talking about consumed water. We're only talking about drinking water. And everyone knew to use the correct well. Almost everyone knew to use the correct well for drinking water. So if you just look at an entire sample population, again, if you don't break out children, we would have this. And if you use the median, you'd be like, okay, well, this community probably is fine. We have a little bit of some people not using the safe sources, accounting for adults and children. But again, if we look at the actual exposure rates, it's much higher. So failing to account for both cooking and drinking consumption and measuring consumption through detailed understanding how people are actually using the water, it just really underestimates exposure. So again, on paper, these are other communities that are check marks. Everyone should be fine. Everything is fine. Sustainable development goals aren't going to address this anymore, but it's still a big issue. So where do we go from here? One thing that we're really interested in looking at is doing some network analysis, so social network analysis. Why do I choose to go to the safe source on certain days and not on other days? So is it that Dahlia-san is going to go get the safe water from the source and I want to go hang out with her, so I go? Or are there certain actors in the community that know to use the safe source and can spread information? So there's two kind of issues we're looking at with this social network in order to get to why people are making certain sources and to see if these networks change during different times of year. So again, during pre-monsoon times, do people orient and talk to different people than say during Diwali or some of the festival time? The other aspect of this is that India is coming to the conclusion of one of those really big initiatives, the Jal Jeevan Mission, Har Ghar Jal, so every household a tap. And this is the district I work in, Nadia, and it almost has 100% coverage. But there's a lot of questions with this because, again, this might be one of those metrics from the people I talk to on the ground where this is 100% coverage, but no water is flowing, right? So the pipes are there, but the water's not flowing. So the dashboards, again, infrastructure means access. We've got all these check marks because this looks good, right? But what's actually happening on the ground, we don't know. And so we're added this to what we want to do because being on the ground, Gokul being on the ground right now is like, oh, we need to look at this. So one of our big questions is, what does coverage mean? What does it mean to different people? And what does it mean in general? So to the agency, does it mean infrastructure? Does that mean coverage? To the district level, does that mean water 1 hour a day? And to residents, does that mean I should be able to turn on my tap and have water? The other thing is, if there's only water 1 hour a day, are we still going to have that same issue with people using, everyone has an on-site well. So is everyone going to just go to the well when the water's not flowing from the tap? And will you still have the same issue of having arsenic exposure because we'll use that for cooking, but I'll collect the water and use the water for drinking when it's on. 24/7 is also a really big issue because when pipes have 24/7 service, they're pressurized. So they're full of drinking water. So the water's putting the pressure out on the pipe. As soon as you turn that water off, then the pressure is negative on the inside. So if there's any contamination in the soil, if there's a latrine nearby, then you can have contamination getting in. So when you go from a community that has pretty much groundwater where you don't have a lot of fecal contamination in a lot of these groundwater wells, you have arsenic, but not fecal contamination because the soil acts as a natural filter, to then piped water that might have contamination in it. Is this going to be an issue as well, which is something we want to look into? And then what's the perception and satisfaction? So for those who have the coverage, are they happy? Those who are adjacent to those who have the coverage, what do they think? When do they think they'll get it? And what do they think it means to have coverage? So these are kind of some of the questions that we want to explore, because this mission is supposed to, I believe, end next year in 2024. Everyone's supposed to have a tap in their home. But again, what that means is going to be something that needs to be looked at. So the talk was on drinking water sustainability and source selection, but I hope I raised some questions for you all to think about, well, how do we measure access and sustainability? And are these metrics that we're using, especially with the Sustainable Development Goal, actually getting to account for those who have access and don't have access? So thank you all, and I will take any additional questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Alfredo. This is just so illuminating especially when you talk about the consumption. It's true, right? We have probably the same source of water, but we consume it very differently. And I think that is something that must be better integrated into this metrics. And I like the way you added nuance to this, how we measure access, how we measure sustainability, how we measure consumption. And I think this will really vary across contexts. Therefore, the importance of further contextualizing this otherwise highly standardized metrics that we have. Yeah, thank you very much. I'll now open the floor for questions or reflections from our audience in person and also online. Unless we have one from the floor, I'd like to ask a question raised by our online participant, Ann Nguyen. Anne said that, thank you, really appreciate your presentation, dedication on this research. These applications are useful in ordinary life. It's quite hard to apply them in harsh conditions in deserts or natural disasters. Could you link your research to those kinds of contexts? And if you have cursory solutions or some research findings related to that? Thank you.
I think that's a great observation. One of the things I mentioned on the first project is data. I think working in drinking water is very difficult because every single data point is one that you have to pretty much go and get yourself. And so it's not like a lot of climate stuff, a lot of climate data. You have, 1 second resolution, stream gauges. You can have 15-minute resolutions. Drinking water, you're lucky if someone measures it every 5 years, honestly. So I think it starts with data. And then if you have data, then you can actually do some mapping. You could do some geospatial statistics. And then like I want to do with the first project is really link disasters or extreme climate, extreme events with failure. And I think that's where it needs to go. That's how some of my work in the US is based. I look at, we call them EJ communities, environmental justice communities, and failure of septic tanks and drinking water wells, and then trying to correlate that with climate events and to look at how climate impacts the failure of some of these resources in environmental justice communities. So it's possible, but you need data. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your nice presentation and very informative and great initiative, basically. But we are working, basically, my associate groups are working in the designing various electronic circuits and devices and also the sensors. So how can we be contribute to your mission? So that's my question is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things is, water sensors that can actually tell you if the treatment plant even is working well. So I told the story about Malvira, and I was really careful to say that it's functioning. I did have data for a whole year from the treatment plant, and it's not efficient. So it's not working, but they have no way of telling. They have no resources there in order to test for fluoride and for aluminum in order to tell whether or not the treatment plant was working. Basically, if they turned it on, they assumed it was working. And so we're working in my lab group, we're working on different ways to measure aluminum based on current density from the plates, because it's electrocoagulation, as a surrogate for water quality, but low cost water quality sensors that could actually give the information to the people who need it are important. That information is usually at the government level and they know everything that's going on, but people on the ground don't. I think other things, that has been the biggest hurdle in the water quality community, is reliable data, and reliable data in the hands of people who need it, which is hard.
Thank you. I can already see there some potential collaboration.
Yeah.
Thank you. While our in-person participants are thinking of their questions and reflections, maybe I'll raise this one quick question by Margot Chavez. I know your research is still developing, but how do you translate your findings from this work back to the community?
Oh, Margot, I know Margot. That's a hard question. She's an anthropologist, so I know she's very concerned about this. So that's where I really hope to get monitors in the hands of people so they can actually know about their water quality. In the past, I have distributed information, but it hasn't been in the right format, right? So when I worked in Ghana, I gave people maps and they were like, oh, this is nice. And they folded it up and put it in their pocket. And I was like, oh, what a failure, right? So the idea moving forward is to really co-create and co-design with the community. So any kind of platform that would be created or any kind of tool that would be created, we would hope to then do a co-design with the operators. So for example, for the electrocoagulation, we're working to see if we can use just current density, which is something everyone can measure with a little meter. If it works, then it would be working with the operator to co-create a method to understand whether or not it's correct. And I think that's where any of this work needs to go. I can't myself say, I'm going to bring it to you and give it to you. You know, we tell the ministry, we tell the faculty in India that we work with, and we distribute the information that way. But that's again in academic circles and political circles. It's really about then once you get down on the ground, co-creating something with the people on the ground to see what they need, what information that they can use, and making it accessible. Otherwise, it's just a map they're going to fold up and put in their pocket and kind of forget about.
Right. Yeah, the importance of considering different actors across levels. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
I have a couple of questions with respect to that Eastern Maharashtra border issue. So one is what is the structure of Gram Panchayat there, particularly in context of the disparity among the members with respect to their social status and wealth. Secondly, is it related to the politics there or not? Like if the project is developed during one political regime and transferred during another might have implication on that. And third is what was the coverage or the percentage of the village population using that project?
So we worked in, we tried to get statistically significant coverage. I'll work backwards. So we tried to get statistically significant coverage of everyone in the villages. So villages of different sizes, we did, I forget exactly what the percentage was that we were getting in each community, but we had a different number of target number per community based on their size so that we had statistically significant coverage of the community. So, because they ranged from like 100 to 500 households, they were smaller, but spread out. And so I think that was maybe one of them was 1,000 households. So we did target it to make sure that in the 1,000 household one, we were getting enough people. So the political regime, for the water infrastructure, we haven't seen like abandonment of the infrastructure because unless something else comes in. So sometimes piped water comes in and everyone's like, we don't need it anymore. That happens. But for communities that don't have piped water or didn't have any other opportunities or any other supply issues or supply available, they weren't abandoning it because of the political change. And there was an election during this process when Modi was elected. And so we did see a change, but it didn't impact politically that. Now for the Gram Panchayat, they have quotas. So there's supposed to be a certain amount of what they call backward caste. There's supposed to be a certain amount of women. And then the other are, anyone can fill those other seats. Now, what we saw is that you do have the surrogacy issue where you'll have someone get elected so that someone else could really sit, you know, if they're elected in name only. But we didn't see that in the successful village. How do you make sure that everyone has the seat that they're elected to? You know, that's impossible, but all we can do is really point out what that does in terms of the cooperation for the community around something like a service provision. So, yeah.
Was there any other similar kind of cooperation project in the village, other than this water. So this would also kind of influence that if they had an experience of a project before, so obviously the probability of managing it better for this project would be more. Yeah.
Yeah, so not to our knowledge. Most of the research, so our public good games were based off of research that is done mainly on agricultural wells. So we've seen that because the shared resource being an aquifer, don't pump as much. And so you see the public good games being done in communities based on agricultural water use. We hadn't really seen anything done in terms of supporting a utility like drinking water. Typically what's done, which was really interesting, typically what's done is that they'll put up a lot of the research would be like, oh, well, we just put up a sheet here, we post something and we list everyone who paid, and that's going to incentivize everyone to get up on the board. Well, we ran a similar game in our groups, and that just tanked it. So people were cooperating, like we have a baseline 10 rounds and everyone's cooperating somewhat. And then we did that one where we put up the names and what everybody contributed and made it public information, and everyone went down to 0. So when talking to our project partners on this, culturally, the area was very sensitive to being kind of like made the sucker, right? And so they didn't want to be the one left holding, like having contributed when no one else contributed. So that public nature, which is used so often in so many other communities, all the literature is like, just put up a board and put everyone's name on it, and then they contribute, tanked it. So yeah, it's the cooperation in this area was a little bit tricky because it's Eastern Maharashtra was left out of a lot of the development that happened in the West, where you have Mumbai and you have a lot of the developments. It was somewhat forgotten a little bit. And so they're very sensitive to that. So things that might have worked in other communities just dropped cooperation completely. And we haven't seen any other formal studies on cooperation in that area.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Professor Joshua Fisher, also one of our cross-appointed faculty members. Josh has 2 questions, but I'll throw the first one to you first. Thank you, Dr. Alfredo. Excellent research, and looking forward to the next steps and new phases of the research. Following on the first question regarding disasters, is your data high enough resolution to look backward and run natural experiments to see whether heat and precipitation anomalies played a role in exposure during your study?
For the arsenic study or for the?
Is it for the arsenic study, Josh? You can type in there. If not, in the next phase, is it possible to design water diary protocols to collect enough fine-grained longitudinal data to do something like that? Arsenic, yeah.
Arsenic, yeah. So what we did with the arsenic, because arsenic will fluctuate depending on the recharge a lot of times. So if it's drier, you'll see arsenic go up during a certain time of year. And then once you have rainfall, if it's rain fed or if it gets any infiltration, it'll go down. Same thing with fluoride. So we do track, when we do this work, I do track the arsenic concentration. So we have it for the moment in time. When we did the diaries, we have the arsenic concentration of that time. Now to look at arsenic over time in terms of the heat and climate, not yet. You need data. Again, data is our limitation. It's been something that I've seen in fluoride a lot, is that I've been able to go in Ghana, I was able to go back over time and look at, for this one region, a different work that had been done in the region and different wells that were sampled to see that over time, fluoride levels on average were increasing. And I suspect that's happening in a lot of places that are having changing rain patterns and not having as much recharge. You'll probably see fluoride concentrations and things like arsenic concentrations starting to concentrate more and increase in concentration over time. It's something I would love to track and look at, but can't do it at this moment. We can do it in the US somewhat because there's more data there. So that's something possible. And I think the USGS, United States Geological Survey that has some work on that, looking at intensification of geogenic contaminants because they have the data, but in other areas, it's just not possible yet.
Josh said that he'd be glad to think through that with you.
Think through that with you, Josh.
And also a follow-up and something that I'm also like a question that I'm thinking about is I'm interested in the social political dimension of this. Have you looked at how, and this is Josh's question again, have you looked at how exposure impacts social cohesion and social dynamics with the current social tensions in parts of India? Do different castes and religious groups have different exposure rates, and does that play any role in social conflict?
So that's where this data is hopefully this research is hopefully going to look at. One of the things that we want to focus on is how are there any intercaste connections within these diagrams, or in one community, do you basically have these two things? You have one caste talking over here and one caste talking over here, and not having a lot of connection to share information. Because if information comes in and it's disseminated on one community, there could be a whole section of the population that's not getting that information. We do have caste information, I believe, in our data, and I should probably rerun the exposure analysis to see if certain castes are more are higher exposure than others. That's not something I did, and I think that's a great idea, and I will rerun those numbers and get back to you, Josh.
Thank you, Catherine. Do we have other questions or comments, thoughts from the floor?
Just one more word on that. It's actually really difficult. We can partner with NGOs that have a lot of information and do surveys like every 2 years, but they can't share sensitive. There's new information restriction laws in India where they can't share information with us. And it's like information that you would typically have on any survey. So caste information. So we can recreate that from the census and say, well, is this a homogeneous or a heterogeneous community, right? So that's something we can recreate, but the person itself, we won't know. We won't know education. A lot of times they won't share education status with us. That's considered sensitive information. I believe in the latest data set that I'm working with an NGO on, they will share us whether or not they'll share with us whether or not the person they interviewed was a male or a female, which again, a lot of times has a lot of influence for responses, especially with water, since mostly women are dealing with water and collecting water. But even that sometimes is really difficult to get. So, data restrictions is another really big issue, even when the data is there, trying to access the things that we would need in order to do a proper regression analysis, sometimes and control for all these factors that we would normally control for, can be difficult. So especially if it's sensitive information.
Okay, so I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
So the first one is just a follow-up with what's been discussed previously. Did you experience any resistance among the local people or rejecting the technology that you brought? That's my first question.
Yeah, so I didn't bring the technology as well, but yes. So, it's really interesting. I don't have the results in this presentation, but it is in the paper for the electrocoagulation plants. When we did see in our willingness to pay study, we did see basically a rejection of a willingness to pay. So any kind of metric to pay, people are like, no, water should be free. And so we did see a certain population that did reject any kind of ask for willingness to pay. And so those protest responses were there, but they weren't significant. They weren't that much. We saw more protest responses with people willingness to pay per container. So how much you're going to collect and paying per volume collected than paying per month. So there is some pushback on certain metrics that we did see.
And my second question was about there should be a local water board in that region, right? So what were they doing? Like, what was their response regarding the contamination?
Yeah, so the way that these worked was that they were given to the Gram Panchayat. Now, the Jal Jeevan mission is different. So they are creating separate water boards in a lot of places. Some places the water boards are also really similar to the Gram Panchayat makeup, but they are trying to create independent water boards that would then be in charge of operating the implementation and the upkeep of the taps in the community. So we're really interested in seeing who's on the boards, how the board's selected, what's the makeup, and what they actually do, and how they integrate within the community. So other places I've worked, community water boards are way more prominent. Like in Africa, there are water boards everywhere. Every village had a water board. Here, it seemed to be the Gram Panchayat functioned also as the water board because they were in charge of collecting a tax, which would be then used to support the water treatment plants in a lot of places. So it wasn't really something that came up as much in terms of like the Gram Panchayat selected the operator talked to the Gram Panchayat, and that was it. There wasn't a separate board that was involved with that handover process.
Mhm. So the Gram Panchayat was in charge of taking care of the water supply in that region. Right?
Oh, no, not the supply, just the treatment plant. So the supply in the region, yeah, there's district level water boards, and the district engineer was really in charge of who got what technology and who was applying for what and paying for what and where it went. But on the village level, when the handover of the utility went from the company to the community, it was handed over to the Gram Panchayat. Am I answering your question? I feel like I'm not.
Yes.
Okay.
But was the Gram Panchayat equipped with the capabilities to do the maintenance after once you
That was the operator. That's the whole issue, right? So they handed it over and they're like, here's your water. And they're like, cool. But there was very little sometimes there was communication, but there might not have been a lot of communication. It was really how the operator communicated with the Gram Panchayat and how the operator communicated with the company during the handover process. So that's where that development theory of hand it over to the community, there's very little guidance on how that handover process should go. It's just the theory is give it to the community to own and operate, and they'll take ownership and it'll be more sustainable, but not really anything about how that should happen. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, for such in-depth analysis. But my question is more about the political aspect. So can we conclude that India, based on your research, I know that there are several provinces, but can we conclude that India lagging behind in implementing this 6 SDGs number 6, or maybe they report different data to the UN, because I'm sure that every government, they report about their success and failures.
So I was looking that up just to see where India was, and in the latest metrics, it just says not enough data. Oh, sorry, not enough data to report. So they were left out of the last round. They're gray when they're looking at the information as to how much, what's the percent that has one of those improved sources, so limited, basic, or safely managed. So I don't know. Now with the Har Jar, the Jal Jeevan mission, you know, they seem to be doing great, but you know, on the ground, I don't know what that's going to look like. So it's going to be an election year. So, you know, Modi wants to get this done before the election year. So the dashboard's up, there's lots of information up. It looks really successful. But from what I hear with project partners on the ground is that it's infrastructure, not necessarily access. So, but we'll see, you know, we have no idea. Hopefully we'll be proven wrong. There will be access to.
Thank you. I think that's where the importance of doing like this ground level research to really go there and do not take all these metrics at face value. Otherwise, we're just going to universalize or apply blanket approach to you know, otherwise very different context. And I've personally, as a social scientist too, I like this approach of going there on the ground and really finding out what's happening, but with partnership with, you know, credible, legitimate local counterparts. I think that's very important in our research.
Yes.
Unless there are other questions from the floor. Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor, for your nice presentation. You mentioned the Jal Jeevan Mission, that is drinking water for all West Bengal residents, right? So do the government provide any individual level arsenic-free water resources like deep tube well water sources, like it is free in our country in some context? So Gram Panchayat in West Bengal, does it provide any individual level arsenic-free water sources?
Yeah, so the communities I was in for the arsenic project, they all had a safe tube well. Whether it was a time tap that was operated by the government, or it was, we were in a lot of communities that had wells drilled by Project Well, so an outside NGO. So a lot of the communities have a safe source within the community, whether it be government supplied or NGO supplied, whether or not people use it. Now with Jal Jeevan Mission, I don't really know where they're getting a lot of it's groundwater that they're pumping. So we hope to also test some of the water quality, especially in West Bengal, just to see what's the quality of the water. So, you know, if you get water to your home, but it has arsenic in it, it's not going to be very helpful. I doubt it will, but you know, you never think that there's going to be lead in water until someone tests it, right? So it's always important to go and test.
All right, I guess, yes, we'll close the floor for questions, and thank you to our online participants for the question. Just for your information, Catherine will stay with us until the end of July. She's going to have another lecture, a different but related lecture on July 7, 5 to 6:30 p.m. down on the first floor of Mirai Crea. Another announcement is that we have opened the call for abstracts for our third NERPS conference, which will be happening next year, March 6 to 9 at Hiroshima University. So if you have abstracts for research presentations, roundtable discussions, and even workshops related to peace and sustainability, please submit it to us until October 15, 2023. And we'll have our upcoming webinars as well. So stay tuned for that. We'll announce it through our social media and through our NERPS newsletter. Thank you so much, Catherine, for this fantastic Q&A as well, and for your research presentation. We wish you success in completing this during your cross appointment. And as a part of the NERPS core membership, I truly support this project, and I encourage everyone at our academic community to support Catherine as well. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much. Thank you.